Cups are my favourite thing to make as a potter. They're so satisfying, there's so many different variations, and they're obviously very, very useful. This is how I make a cup from start to finish. Before the wheel, I have to weigh and wedge my clay up, and then I sit down at the wheel and get to throwing. For this cup, I used 280 grams of clay. The most important part of throwing is making sure the clay is properly centered. I always cone the clay up and down a few times, and especially today, as I'm using reclaimed clay. Coning helps to align all of the clay particles, and it kind of gives it an extra little wedge. Once it's centered, I open up the clay puck, widen it, and compress the base a little bit. Then I pull up the walls. When making a straight-sided cylinder, it's really important to focus on applying more pressure to the outside fingers rather than the inside ones, and this will help to make a cone shape or like a volcano shape on the first pull, fighting the centrifugal force that the wheel is putting on the clay. On the second pull, I let the clay flare out a little bit more. And after a quick measure up, I do the final pull, and I do a little bit of finessing in the shaping department at the same time. Then I'll use a rib to get rid of any excess slip on the outside, and I always compress the rim in between to keep everything nice and sturdy. After that, the throwing's done, and it's time to remove it from the wheel. With all my pots, I remove the water from the inside and use my wooden knife tool to create a little chamfer for the wire. I like the sliding method when removing pots from the wheel so that I don't have to dry my hands in between each cup. So I squeeze my sponge out onto the wheel head, and then when pulling the wire through, I make sure to drag some of that water with it. And that pulls the pot off the wheel, and then I can pop it off and place it onto a wearboard to dry. These dried overnight, but because it's still a little bit chilly here in London at this time of year, they needed a little bit longer before I could trim them. When the weather's like this, I find that flipping the pots over and giving them another hour or two to dry upside down really helps. Sometimes after using the water method to remove the pots, they can get really stuck to the bat though, and this one was very stuck. So I decided to wire it off, and sometimes they kind of like pop off halfway through like this pot did, and it left a little uneven half moon of clay that I had to even out while I was trimming. And the other one popped off the bat quite easily when I coaxed it off. I like to make my handles at this stage so that they can harden up a little bit whilst I trim. For a long time, I pulled my handles, but I found that the slightly rounded look of pulled handles meant that it wasn't quite matching the squared energy that my pots have, so I decided to make them with slabs instead. I do think that pulling handles is a skill that all throwers should know though, so one day I'm going to make a video about different styles of handle. Anyway, I roll out a big slab and then I use these guides to cut a whole lot of long strips. Then I cut each strip into 3-ish smaller strips and they become blanks for my handles. I give each side a sponge and then I place them onto this dowel to form their shape. For trimming, I stick my pot down by wetting the wheel head, swirling it around a little bit with the wheel moving to create a bit of slip, check it centered, and then I give it just a little tap to stick it down. These need very little done to them at this stage. It's just kind of an exercise in tidying up, really. I drag my loop tool across the base, a quick drag over the walls, and then I create a more refined chamfer, which is a 45-degree angle on the shoulder, and that's it. I swipe it down with a sponge and it's ready for its handle, which are now leather hard after trimming all of my pots. I like to make sure that the curve of the handle is the exact round arch that I like, and I have found that this random little pot that I made years ago is the perfect former. The tails both get trimmed to the form of the cup and then scored. The cup where it will hold the handle is also scored. A little slip is applied to the handle and then I just kind of squash it on. When I press the handle on, I always make sure to support the inside of the cup with my other hand to stop it from warping or misshaping at all. Then I fettle each surface of the handle where it joins to the cup with my wooden knife tool. And then I follow up with a quick wee sponge down to get everything looking real beautiful and spick and span. After drying out for a week or so, the cups can be bisque fired and then glazed. Full disclosure, the pot that I am showing you how to glaze on is not the same pot. The kiln hadn't quite cooled down enough for me to unload it yet, so we're using a little stand-in. For glazing, you need glaze, a mixing brush, some water and a sponge, and your pot. You also need a jug or something to pour your glaze with. You can see that my glaze has separated from the water on top, so it needs a really good mix. I always mix it for a minute or so, and if it's still lumpy, I'll pour it through a sieve. This glaze was good to go after just mixing though. So I fill up my measuring jug, I pour it into the cup, hold it for a few seconds, and tip it back out. Then I can hold the cup on the base, plunge it down into the bucket with the rim down. I will hold it for a few seconds, then I pull it back out and shake off any drops. Flip it back over and I dab the fingerprints with a little bit of extra glaze to fill them in. Once it's dried to the touch, I can hold it really firmly, turn it over and sponge the base off. Then it goes back into the kiln for a second firing and it's finished. It's hard to believe how much of a change that ceramics go through in the kiln. And I really adore this honey glaze that I made recently, it's quite interesting like how it goes from this red colour to this beautiful deep yellow. That's it. As always, please let me know if you have any questions. Follow me on the other socials at mae.ceramics, and I will see you next week for another video. Bye babes, love you.